for Humanities Information, along with Comparative Literature Department. Today's speaker is Mark Algee-Hewitt, Assistant Professor of English and Digital Humanities at Stanford, and Eric Hayo, Director of the Center for Humanities and Information, will be introducing him shortly. Before turning things over to Eric, I'd like to announce the next week's speaker. Our Luncheon speaker for the next week will be Robert Casarillo, Professor of English at Penn State. He will give a talk on modernist queer Shakespeare, William the Lion and the Fox. Okay. Now Eric will introduce today's speaker, Alex.
Hi folks, thanks for coming. The Center for Humanities and Information is sponsoring this talk. It's also organizing a conference that's happening this Friday and Saturday in Luncheon. Everyone's welcome. It'll be free food and interesting conversation. There'll certainly be free food, and there may be interesting conversation. So if you come, I know a chance of the second, but no definite chance of the first. Midnight and 9 to 5 on Friday, and 9 to 2. 9 to 1 on, nice, that's good. That should be a contest for most embarrassing cell phone ring. I would say he was talking about his own phone was going off, but he didn't realize it, so he kept looking around the audience angrily. So, at least that didn't happen to you. Mark Algee-Hewitt, our guest today, was director of the Stanford Computer Lab for a couple of years before becoming an assistant professor at Stanford and director of the Literary Lab. He is working on a special book called The Afterlife of Aesthetics, which, what did you just say? You said it looks at stuff people say about
it looks at a large number of it looks at a big archive of people saying things.
People saying things.
About aesthetics.
So basically that's what he does. He works on big archives of people saying things. Those archives include novels and all that kinds of text. He is the collaborator on a number of textually oriented projects, both literary and non-literary, both at Stanford and beyond Stanford. One of the major figures, I think, in the new forms of intellectual collaboration in humanities that come around these new methods. I think that might be something you talk about. I don't know if they have to come around new methods, but they have tended to. And also someone who's thinking really, really seriously and interestingly, as we're going to see, about multi-disciplinarity in the novel. So please join me in welcoming Mark Algee-Hewitt.
Thank you so much, Eric, for that generous introduction. Hopefully I'll answer your promise of talking about lots of people saying things. And thank you all for coming. This is a real treat. Because usually when I present projects in this stage, and this is still very much a project in progress, it's within a lab environment to a group of people who are somewhat cognizant of what we've been thinking and what I've been thinking and what's going on. So the chance to talk to you about it and get some outside opinions is incredibly valuable, and I'm very excited to see what you think. I should also say that because I'm used to speaking within a literary lab type environment, I'm also not used to the whole I talk and then you ask questions. So if at any point I say anything that is confusing, infuriating, or you just super agree with me, by all means, I am more than willing to stop at any point and explain what I'm thinking or what's going on. So by all means, you're welcome to yell out. So the project that I wanted to talk to you about today is, as I said, one that's still very much in progress, one that we've been thinking about in the lab for a year or so now, that we've called somewhat controversially between ourselves, Microgenres, modeling multidisciplinarity in the novel. Controversially, as you'll see, because what we're talking about may or may not be micro and may or may not be genres, but that's part of the argument that I want to make. Before I launch into the project, I wanted to acknowledge that I keep saying we, and I mean it when I say we. Like many of our projects in the literary lab, this one is a collaboration between, in this case, a number of people at all sorts of different levels and walks of life within the university, from fellow faculty members to graduate students to undergraduate assistants, et cetera, et cetera. And so the work that I'm going to show you is very much a product of the kind of collaboration and discussion and co-work that we can do within the literary lab environment. And in fact, I'll point out as we go along that there are certain people who are responsible for various parts, both as a way of crediting them and also as a way of saying, if you disagree with them, then it's really them and not me you should be talking to. So, microgenres. What do we mean by a microgenre? This is what I mean by a microgenre. This is from William Godwin's Caleb Williams, a novel from 1794. And it's a really good example of what I mean because it tends to wear what it's doing on its surface. Godwin, of course, is well known as an author of quasi-Gothic texts, particularly Caleb Williams, or as it's originally called, Things as They Are, as well as books like St. Leon. But he was also a well-known political theorist. Political Justice, for example, came out almost in tandem with Caleb Williams, and the idea behind their not quite co-release is that they should be two texts that speak to each other. What Godwin was trying to do theoretically and politically in Caleb Williams, in Political Justice, he was also trying to show in practice in Caleb Williams, which leads us to passages like this. In this part of the novel, the protagonist, Caleb Williams, as you might guess, has been captured by the evil Squire Falkland for a crime that he didn't commit, trumped up charges based on the fact that he's uncovered a dark secret out of Falkland's past, making it a very Gothic novel, and is then imprisoned. But while he's in prison, he takes the occasion to think upon the condition of the mind and the soul while in prison, saying, among other things, the last line, cruel, inexorable policy of human affairs that condemns a man to torture like this, that sanctions it and knows not what it has done under its sanction, that is too supine and unfeeling to inquire into these petty details, that calls this the ordeal of innocence and the protector of freedom. This is not the typical thoughts, obviously, of a young man who's been imprisoned. Instead, what happens in this passage is that Godwin transitions from writing a novel, a narrative, a Gothic narrative in this case, into doing something else. And it's that transition into something else that this project is all about. Here, if I was making a literary critical argument, I would say that Godwin starts off writing narrative and then transitions into writing political philosophy, for example. You can imagine other places where this is the case. Tolstoy is fairly infamous for this, and in fact, if he wasn't a Russian, I would have used him as the example. Tolstoy, who writes narrative in something like War and Peace, but interspersed with history. Places where the reader is not feeling like this is history being narrated by a character in a novel, but actually is relating history. And the genesis of this project is the idea that when this happens within the novel, or novels, there's actually a transformation of the text. That is, the narrative or the novel writing gives way to a different disciplinary discourse. A micro-transition, a micro-generic shift. Now, normally this is when I would pull up a theorist and say, you see, we're already thinking about this, and we were thinking about it long, long ago, and so we're using new methods to talk about something that people have already theorized. I am not saying that this time. In fact, I am putting up Bakhtin now, so I don't get a Bakhtin question, to say that this is explicitly not what we're talking about. Bakhtin, of course, famously thought about heteroglossia and the dialogic principle of the novel, which is a polyphony of many, many voices that come together in a way that other types of writing, like, for example, poetry, do not. What's different about what we're saying versus Bakhtin is that Bakhtin says this is the condition of the novel, that at all times it's operating in different registers and different voices that are jumbled, confused together, and in their chorus make up a novel. We're talking about moments of explicit transition when, at the level not just of content, and this is key, but at the level of style, something changes in the writing of a novel. Microgenres, but not heteroglossia. So when we decided to start thinking about this, we needed a set of different disciplinary genres, different disciplinary writing, and novels to compare them to that were in some ways limited. Of course, the literary history we could have looked at, it spans multiple centuries, and the configuration of disciplinarity, and academic disciplinarity, and novel writing is very different across them. So we felt we needed to limit ourselves quite a bit. And the reason that we chose the period we did, and the period we chose specifically, was things written between 1870 and 1914, has to do with a certain theory about the history of disciplinarity. For example, in 1890, we had the Second Land Grant Act for US colleges. The rise of civic universities in the UK starts about 1900, and we have statistics on this that show the explosion, not just of university populations, but of members of particular disciplines of that time. The number of PhDs, the number of MAs, the number of professional degrees skyrocket during this period, particularly in the US and Britain, and we're speaking pretty much about the English-speaking world in this project. And that makes it a really interesting point, wherein if we can find ways to detect the way disciplinarity, or ulterior disciplinarity, sneaks its way into the novel, that might say something about the novel from this period, but it also says something about the ways in which disciplinary writing was construed during the same period. One of our members, in fact, Abigail Droge, works on this particularly, and I owe her for the stats that we used when we were making these decisions. So, we sat down, as a group of us, thinking through this period, and we built a corpus. We chose 7 non-novel writing disciplines, here you can see them, and we looked for 10 books each from the disciplines, and found them and digitized them and did a lot of corrective work. And I have to shout out to our RAs who worked on the project, particularly Kelsey Reardon, who somehow sat and tagged 70 books for blocks of text, footnotes, tables of contents, running headers. There were 3,000 texts in Marx's Capital all by itself, which is just staggering, and I don't know how she did it. But we made this corpus, and this, of course, is not a complete disciplinary corpus, and part of what I want to talk to you about is the ways in which this is interestingly incomplete. But these were 7 disciplines that we were interested in exploring vis-a-vis their intersection with the novel. And you'll note that it's not a large corpus by digital humanities standards. We're used to working on thousands or tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of texts. And this is 70, and I shall see slightly more than 70 books. But a curated corpus in this case gives us the ability, as I'm hoping to show you, to not just do digital work that does criticism in a different way, but allows us to reflect on the results that it shows in a way that we might be able to make them meaningful to a literary critical audience. In other words, we don't just want to know, does the novel transition? We want to know how that happens and why that happens. But, because we're also talking about the novel, we also looked for 26 novels from the same period, looking for a mix of genres, from early science fiction, the Gothic Dracula, Ben-Hur, more popular fiction, up through more high modernism from, for example, Virginia Woolf or James Joyce. And so, we started the project with this corpus and 2 questions. 1, is it true that novels stylistically diverge from the genre of the novel into other disciplinary modes? And if it is, can we detect it automatically using some kind of computational method? And I keep using the word style, and I'm doing that very particularly because one of the things that I was very clear on at the beginning of this project, and that one of the things that's made this project so difficult, not to do, but to think through, is that I'm less interested, and I think I speak for the group, we are less interested in where these transitions, these microgeneric shifts happen in the level of content. That is, it's less interesting when all of a sudden a character in a novel starts talking about psychology, for example, or uses the word anthropology. Those are easily detectable. But what we're interested in is whether or not there is a disciplinary style. That is, in this period, from 1870 to 1914, do anthropologists write like anthropologists? Do natural scientists write like natural scientists in a way that is measurable from the words that they chose? So, for our feature set, we decided to completely, at least at the outset, as you'll see, eschew lexical or semantic features, using only grammatical and syntactical elements of the text. For every book, we divided it into a number of segments. We did one experiment where, and I'll show you both, where we divided it into 50-sentence segments. And we did another one where we divided it into 200 sentence segments. And in each segment, we looked at the percentage of different parts of speech from each segment, the number of named entities that were people, the number of named entities that were things, the average length of sentences, and the mean number of clauses per sentence in each segment. And those of you who are familiar with this kind of work will probably have guessed exactly where I'm going, because this is exactly how you set up a classification model, or some kind of machine learning model. And in fact, that is what we did. The first step was to see if, based on these features, we could reliably, in some way, tell the different disciplines apart. That is, could we create a model where we could pass it a 200-sentence section from either a disciplinary text or a novel, and have the computer recognize what it was. And for this, we used a discriminant function analysis, and I'm happy to explain more about what that is. But we chose it mostly because it both allowed for hard classifications, that is, the computer will return a result saying, I think this is anthropology, or I think this is psychology. But it also gives us a posterior probability, that is, for every segment, a distribution of what it may or may not be. And so, we used, as I said, linear discriminant analysis. We separated the corpus into training and test sets, keeping books together. So we used about 75% of the texts to train on, classified 25%. We downsampled our segments because some disciplines have really, really long books and some have much shorter books. So we kept the number of segments consistent. And we returned the classification percentage for the entire test corpus. And for each segment, we both assigned the hard classification, so the computer's guess as to what this chunk of text comes from, as well as the probability that it comes from that versus anything else. And what does that look like? Well, these are our initial set of results. This is our 200-sentence experiment. So for each 200-sentence chunk, and there are around, give or take, 15,000 of them, this confusion plot shows what the computer guessed. Each bar represents the actual discipline, and the colors are what it was classified as. And what you can see immediately is that for every bar, most of the segments were classified correctly. Overall, our success rate was 78%. And honestly, this was kind of astonishing at the beginning. This is that point where we said, we should try this. It's probably not going to work. And then it totally turned out to work. That is, not based upon the words, but based upon the syntax and the grammar alone. With 78% accuracy, we could tell, or we could create a computer model that could tell the difference between, say, for example, philosophy and political writing, or between natural science and history. So clearly, there are markers of disciplinary style embedded within the grammar and the syntax of the texts. When we moved to 50-sentence segments, it got a little bit worse, as one might expect. There's less data to operate on each level, but still, we have a success rate of about 65 or 66%. Now, remember, if we were just randomly assigning chunks to novels, our success rate should be 1/9, so we should be less than 10% correct. Instead, we are 66% correct, meaning, again, even at the level of 50-sentence segments, we're still able to find disciplinary signals embedded within grammatical styles. And that difference between 250 will be important, as I will show you. So this gave us a way of thinking through the large experiment as a whole, that is, can we tell the difference between disciplines based on their style? But within an individual novel, we could also use those posterior probabilities to start examining and identifying different parts of novels that seem to be interesting. This, for example, is a graph of Joseph Conrad's novel, Nostromo. And each bar is one of our 200-sentence segments. So, and they go in order from beginning to end. So the first bar is the first 200 sentences, the second 200, et cetera, et cetera. And the colors of the bar are the posterior probabilities of classification for each of those segments. Most of these are, of course, blue, because most of Joseph Conrad's novel, Nostromo, is classified as a novel, but not all. In fact, you can see that at a couple of really important points, there are places where the model was either confused. That is, it pretty evenly classified the one that I have the arrows pointing to as probably being history, but maybe anthropology and maybe natural sciences. Or later on, you can see a bar that's predominantly red. It was fairly confident that that was written like anthropology. It's a different kind of methodology, because usually when you're using classification analysis, you're looking for success, right? You're interested in successfully classifying things. In fact, this is the opposite. We're interested not where the model's successful, because that's kind of boring. We're interested in where the model fails. In other words, I give all of this to a computer and say, this is all a novel. What do you think? And it says, well, I think most of it's a novel, but this doesn't look like a novel. That's the part that's interesting, because that's our argument of where the novel moves away from a novel and into a different kind of writing. Most of our novels, however, looked a lot like this. This is the average novel. This is Portrait of a Lady and Sons and Lovers. I gave a little presentation on this in Paris, and the French literary critics who I was talking to, being French literary critics, the first question they asked, can you use this then to find the most pure novel of your period? Which is totally the thing we're not interested in, but the answer is yes. The most pure novel of the 19th century or the early 20th century is D.H. Lawrence's Sons and Lovers. So you can take that and go away with it. But this, in fact, by and large, is what our corpus looked like a lot. That is, there are a few places you can see at the beginning of Portrait of a Lady where it seems to be more history than anything else, but most novels look like novels. What's interesting is the places where they don't. And this lets us dig into those results and see what's actually going on. Take, for example, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's A Study in Scarlet, the first Sherlock Holmes novel. Most of it looks like a novel. But there's one place very particular that doesn't. Obviously, the 8th bar there, which seems evenly split between anthropology on the one hand and natural science on the other. I'm showing you this as an example both because it's a fairly easy one to follow, and also this was my aha moment in the project. This is the one where I first looked at it and said, wow, I think we actually found something interesting here. Doyle's novel, I don't know how many of you are familiar, it's the first Sherlock Holmes novel, and it's divided very cleanly into two parts. The first part, the first half, is the mystery. Someone's killing people in London, and Sherlock Holmes and Watson have to figure out who it is. They find out who it is in the middle of the book, and the second half turns into a very different kind of story, an adventure story set in Western America, particularly in Utah, which explains how this man came to live among the Mormons and why he was taking revenge and killing them in England. And, of course, it is exactly at that moment when the novel shifts that this bar, this change, this shift occurs. The first part, from the Sierra Nevada to Nebraska, from the Yellowstone River to the North Colorado, etc., is a description of Utah, the wild, natural scenery that's so very different from the kind of urban London that was being narrated in the first part. Then, the second part of this 200-sentence chunk moves from a description of the natural scenery to the first encounter with the Mormon people, described as a foreign people. In other words, when we actually sat down and read the text of this 200-sentence segment that seemed to be a confusion between natural science and anthropology, what we found is that the first half was natural description, and the second half was an anthropological catalog of a different people. And this is the part that's so cognitively hard to get around. This seems to work really, really well, but we didn't give it any words. It's not operating on whether or not it says people, whether it says tribe, whether it says anything. It is merely grammatical and syntactical shifts. Somehow Doyle is using the language, the style, the syntax of natural science and anthropology to do literary work. It got even more interesting when we looked at it in terms of 50-sentence segments instead of 200-sentence segments. This is the same bar. This time, however, because it's 50, it's actually separated across 3 or 4 segments. And you can see that, in fact, the first segment of those 3 is mostly green, mostly natural science. Then there's a bar that's almost entirely blue. And then there's a bar that's mostly anthropology in red here. What's that blue bar doing there? Well, the first part that corresponds was exactly what we thought. It is that 50-sentence slice that talks about the description of the wild scenery of Utah. The second part, that blue bar, all of a sudden moves into a dialogue between the protagonist of this part of the novel and his young ward. This was classified by our model as almost 100% likely to be a novel. And then the third part moves us into that first glimpse of the Mormons and their wagon train and suggests that, in fact, once again, we've undergone a shift towards some other kind of disciplinary style. Really, really compelling results, at least we thought so at the beginning, and we're still convinced they're very, very compelling, but really, really hard to interpret. What does it mean to write like an anthropologist in the 19th century versus using anthropological words? To illustrate, this is, of course, what the reader sees from that natural science type description. And we're all familiar with reading this, and we can read it and understand the natural science. This is what we gave the computer. I mean, we gave the computer counts of this. But this is effectively what the computer reads. Somehow, this looks like natural science. And for those of you who are not familiar with part of speech tags, each one of these 2-letter or 3-letter codes corresponds to a different kind of word. NN is noun, NNP is proper nouns, JJs are adjectives, anything that starts with these, some form of a verb, etc. This is what we gave to the computer to be able to classify. And you can see the cognitive problem here. Because we want to be able to say, well, it's picking up on all these anthropological words, except it's not. It's picking up on anthropological, or here, natural science parts of speech. So we tried a number of different ways to try and dig in and see what parts of speech are causing the effects that we saw. Our first, for ill-timed effort, is we tried to combine them both in one view. So here, it's that passage again, but the colors of the words correspond to different parts of speech. Nouns are red, adjectives are in green, etc., etc. And this was difficult to read and not particularly helpful, because it's almost as hard to read these colors as it is to try and read the parts of speech themselves. And so we had to think more about ways in which we could try and see what is causing the computer to be able to do this kind of separation. And eventually what we hit upon is a correlation. So we correlated the number, or the number of each of our features to the percentage success of it being correctly classified within a disciplinary style. In other words, anthropology, good example, most correlated with a high instance of CD or cardinal digits, then adjectives, then comparative adjectives, then proper nouns, or proper plural nouns, etc., etc. Least correlated with prepositions, the number of named entity persons, and the number of clauses. In other words, anthropology seems to use sentences with few numbers of clauses, but a lot of digits and a lot of comparative adjectives.
Does it use those, or the number of clauses doesn't correlate well with deciding what anthropology is?
Both. So it uses all of these features. We did a stepwise variable selection to see what is important to the model, and it turns out there's a lot of variables that are important to the model. And the correlation lets us assign for each category or each group what is important to the decision to put it in that category. So it's a little bit of both. It's a fairly small feature set for what we're trying to classify, which is what's actually kind of interesting about it. But this gave us a way to think through, what does it mean to write philosophically? What does it mean to write like a novel? And a novel is an interesting one, of course, because it has a lot of personal pronouns in a way that other disciplines don't. Most scientific writers aren't writing about I and he and she, and it's got a lot of named people. Versus something like politics, which has a lot of determiners, and apparently really, really long sentences. But this gave us a way to think through what is going on below the surface in this analysis. But the question kept coming up, what about words? So we repeated the experiment with a lexical feature set. So we did the exact same thing, because we wanted to compare what the lexical and grammatical results would be. And instead of using those grammatical features, we used the 200 most frequent nouns in the corpus, the 75 most frequent verbs, and the 25 most frequent adjectives and adverbs. And to no one's surprise, it actually worked really, really well. It turns out that if you use anthropological words, it's easy to tell that this is writing anthropology, which in many ways is not the interesting thing that we wanted to find, but it's a good sanity check. This worked well. And it was actually kind of fun to do this, and to some degree illuminating to do this with the novel in the same way. In other words, this is also the same study in Scarlet, separated into 50-sentence segments. And you'll see that those 3 segments, which are should be around 29, 30, and 31, so somewhere in here, are actually all successfully categorized as a novel. That is, at this part, Doyle is using novel-y words, but writing in a style that's not novel-y at all. Conversely, at number 20, for example, Doyle is writing like a novel, but he's using words that are very redolent of a different discipline, in this case, history. This is actually that segment. It's a relation from the newspapers by Watson, or Watson's relating the newspapers, about the sensational coverage of the case in the press, using words that seem to have something to do with history. And in fact, when we look at the same kind of correlation analysis for the lexical features, we really get a good glimpse of what the different disciplines were at the time. My favorite is philosophy. Apparently the words most correlated with philosophy are reality, beauty, sense, object, and relation. But you can see how the lexical gives us a kind of window into the words that help us correlate what's going on with the graphical. But we wanted a way to look at everything all at once. And so we made a graph that requires some explanation. This is the graph we casually refer to as the Kraken graph, and I'll let you figure out why. This is a very multidimensional graph that shows a number of things simultaneously. Every dot on this graph is one of the segments, 50-sentence segments from our corpus. It is placed on the graph based on what it is classified as, and it is colored by what it actually is. So, for example, history is green here, but the placement of the green dots has more to do with what the model thought that chunk of a history text was versus what it actually is. And this is done with both grammatical, which are circles, and lexical, which are squares. So every segment of our corpus is represented twice on this graph. Once in terms of how it's classified grammatically, and once as it's in terms of how it's classified lexically. And the size of the dot is the inverse to how successful the classification was. So things that are novels and are classified by novels are really small. Things that are novels but were classified as history are really big. And you can see right away that there's a relationship between the inside and the outside of the graph, as well as between our lexical and grammatical features. For example, if we take away all the lexical, this is just grammatical classifications, you can see that there's a large area of the center which is very big. Those are all misclassifications. So those are places where the model is unsure of what it is, or it was misclassified as something. Lexically, everything moves out to the edge, because of course the lexical, as we looked at, is much more certain. But what's good about this graph is that we can use it in tandem with those other plots to find places that are really interesting from a microgeneric standpoint. For example, this graph, I've taken out all of the novels except for A Study in Scarlet, and I've left in all of the disciplinary texts. And if we go looking, we can find in this area, zooming in, Doyle's A Study in Scarlet number 29. That's the one that was categorized as natural science. And you can see within this graph that in fact, it's hiding next to 2 yellow dots, which are J.J. Wood's natural science, as well as a number of other things that are not novels. In the same way, if we zoom into this part, we can see near the center number 31, which is the part that's classified as anthropology, and a large number of small blue dots, which are actually anthropological texts. So the relative positions of the different classified segments let us understand the disciplinary constellation in which each one exists. So if we zoom in, for example, to the lexical one that we took a look at, section number 20, you can see that lexically you have this big blue square that is actually a novel, but among other green dots, which are all history. Okay, so what can we do with this? Well, we can do the same thing I just did with Sherlock Holmes and use that to find really interesting microgenerical shifts within the novel. For example, Dracula. Dracula is a good case study because, as we know from reading Dracula, its use of media means that Doyle is trying to imitate other kinds of styles. And this lets us see whether or not he's simply adopting a kind of textual format or whether he's actually importing the grammar, the syntax, and the style of what he's trying to imitate. These are both Dracula. The top one is classified by the grammatical features, and the bottom one is classified by the lexical features. And of course, the lexical one is more novel-looking, and the grammatical one has more different shifts that we've detected. But in fact, there are some interesting places. For example, right here, in the, I think that's around the 30th segment, there's a run of text that does not appear grammatically to be a novel. And in fact, it's echoed in the lexical features by not appearing to be lexically like a novel. But the interesting part is that it's natural science according to its grammar and history according to its lexemes. It actually exists right there, and you can see it embedded among lexical history, but grammatical natural science. It's in the center of the graph here. Well, what is it? It is, in fact, is the point of the novel where the Demeter, the ship that Dracula uses to arrive in England, pulls into harbor, and it's a narrated account by a newspaper reporter in a simulated newspaper article describing how the reporter went on board, looked around, and what he found. It's a really interesting case because we didn't have journalism in our corpus. So what's happened here, we think, is that because we don't have a reference corpus of journalism, our model understood that this was not a novel, somehow, but it didn't have exactly what it was, so it made its best guesses in terms of the things that it could see. And so journalism appears to be written much more like natural science in its syntax, but using words having to do with history. And just to remind you, this is what natural science is in terms of grammar and history in terms of its lexicon. Picture of Dorian Gray actually offers a couple of other really interesting places. Looking at it again, top and bottom, grammatical and lexical, you can see that again it looks mostly like a novel, but there are really interesting points of departure. And for those of you familiar with Dorian Gray, and as someone who does the history of aesthetics, I'm always deeply interested in what's going on in Oscar Wilde. There is a number of really interesting moments here that I don't know if we necessarily recognize as microgenerical, but come up in the model. For example, right here, in the lexical features, we seem to have a departure from the novel into, it's a little hard to make out, I'm sorry, it's a blue bar, which appears to be philosophy. Over here, towards the end, something that reads lexically very much as a novel, but grammatically looks mostly like anthropology with a little bit of history and psychology mixed in. And then in the middle, we've got something that appears to be history, both lexically and grammatically. Well, what are they? Looking at that first one and zooming in, you can see that big green square, or sorry, bluish square, among all of those pink dots. That is philosophy, and a big part of the novel is classified as not philosophy. Looking at it, this is a dialogue between Basil, Lord Henry, and Dorian about the meaning of beauty in the world. What's really interesting looking at this is that this content here is very, very much philosophy. It's all about theories of beauty in mind, but written as a dialogue that is grammatically and stylistically very much like a novel. And as you can see, it uses a large number of people and proper pronouns, but uses words like sense, object, relation, existence, experience, and most importantly, I think in this example, truth. Moving on to that passage at the end, which you find sort of right in the center of the graph, and zooming in, you can see that it's in a kind of confusion of disciplinary spaces grammatically. That is, it's clearly not a novel, but we're not exactly sure what it is. And in fact, when we looked at it, we have Dorian going through the city streets. This is actually when he's on his way to commit his first murder. Looking at the landscape of London, speaking of it in terms of the description of the people and the places that he's passing. What's interesting is that lexically, this is very much a novel, but this time grammatically, it's very much not a novel. This is, if you recall, mostly classified as anthropology. In other words, our model was able to catch a place where he's not using any anthropological words, but the kind of writing that Wilde is putting forward here has more in common with certain kinds of anthropological writing than it does novels. And again, you can see what the difference between anthropology and the novel is. And finally, we had that other place within the novel, that is that middle section that both lexically and grammatically was misclassified as history. And in fact, they're both sitting within the same square. It's a bit of a view, so I've only labeled the two Dorian Gray. But you can see that most of the things around them are, in fact, history. So whatever's going on here, it seems to agree that it has something to do historically. And if we look at the text, this is when Dorian gets very, very into gemology and treats the reader to a history of great gems in England. And if you read it through, I'm not going to bore you by reading it out loud, but it not only contains lots of history-like words, but the kind of style, the long list of multiple clauses as he traces the history and different kinds of gems really suggests a different disciplinary style, even as the content echoes it. Of course, if we look at it, we can see that grammatically history is a large number of places, a large number of persons, and many, many, many clauses. That's why coordinating conjunctions are also near the top. So clearly, what we've been able to do is within the novels that we're interested in, and I argue outside of those, and we can talk a little bit more about that, but in the novels, in our corpus, at least originally, we've been able to find places that don't necessarily jump out as all of a sudden Wilde is no longer writing a novel, but instead is now writing history, but in fact very much are those kinds of places. Which is great, but it begs the question, what can we do with this? What happens when we start looking at this at scale? And this is actually the point at which the project is right now. The question currently on the table among the group is, this is really interesting and it's probably an important point that there are disciplinary styles, but what can we do with this? And this is still what we're trying to figure out, but we have a couple of ideas. For example, this is Edward Bellamy's Looking Backwards and H.G. Wells' A Modern Utopia. Both of them novels, both of them considered to be proto-science fiction. Bellamy is kind of a time travel book. I won't bore you with the details if you haven't read it. Don't, because it's incredibly boring. Speaking as a romanticist. Some of my modernist friends would disagree with me. And H.G. Wells, of course, is known for early science fiction writing, but in this case, it's a utopian text. In fact, both of these very much occupy the genre of utopian text. And classified by grammatical features, it's immediately striking that neither of these look anything like a novel. Most novels look like novels with a couple of breaks, as we've seen. These look like something else. So there seems to be a certain kind of genre speaking this time of different kinds of novel writing, differentiation between how microgeneric shifts happen. Science fiction, and in fact, we're doing a separate project on how science fiction uses the language and grammar of science to build its worlds. Science fiction seems to be doing something very different and mobilizing microgeneric shifts in order to do something important in trying to convince readers of things. And in fact, when we look at them lexically as well, they also evidence a number of disciplinary departures, as we might expect. But what's really interesting is if you compare, they're different disciplines. These appear to be mostly anthropology and politics and psychology, whereas this is mostly economics and natural science and history. So that division between what the grammar of the text seems to indicate its discipline is versus lexically what kinds of words Wells and Bellamy are drawing on, this suggests a strong correlation between genre and microgenre, but also that that grammar and lexemes are doing something different within the scope of novel writing. So, from disciplinary differentiation, from the style of certain kinds of disciplines, from the ways those styles are embedded in the novel, and to a larger argument about what we hope to be genre and microgenre. This project has taken us through a large number of cognitive difficulties trying to understand, trying to read grammar while we're simultaneously trying to read lexemes, but I think it's deeply indicative of the way in which style, and in fact disciplinary style, are deeply informative of the ways in which novels try and get things done. Thank you.
So we have time for questions. Mark, you can just call on people as you see them.
I have one question that immediately sprung to mind, and that's concerning the training data that you used. So how exactly did you train the computer to recognize these features and classify these passages accordingly?
Right, so we did two things. Because the corpus is big when we divide it up into chunks, but in terms of, or segments, but in terms of actual number of books, it's not on the huge side. It has, hold on, 70 plus 29. 99 texts in it. And so what we did is, first we just classified everything using a discriminant function analysis, and then did a leave one out tenfold cross-validation in order to get the confusion matrices. And then for the actual model that we used to classify the individual novels, we divided it into a training and test set. So we took 70% of the novels, and this is important. So we didn't segment it until we actually divided it up. So we took 70% of the novels, so about, or 70%, sorry, not of the novels, of the texts. You can see I'm used to thinking about literature. 70% of the texts sampled evenly across all of the different disciplines in the novels, and then broke those up into either 200 or 50 sentence segments. And then we took the remaining 29 and broke those up into segments, downsampled to make sure that we, across the different disciplines in each one, had consistent numbers, and then trained on the 70% and validated with the remaining 30%. And then used that model to classify the novels that we were interested in, which we had left out from both the training and the test set.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it just wasn't really clear on the methodology, but that's pretty standard procedure. So.
Yeah.
So sociolinguistics have known for a very long time that women are increasingly more creative as syntacticians, grammarians, and lexical users. And I noticed that you had a whole bunch of women's writing in here, but you didn't talk about them at all. Could you say something about that?
Yes, but nothing interesting, because I don't know if we just chose the wrong books, for example, we were all really excited about Virginia Woolf, because we were going to see, this is going to be awesome. And it turns out that To the Lighthouse, and we tried it, I didn't show it here, Orlando and Mrs. Dalloway. Mrs. Dalloway was a little bit more interesting. Mrs. Dalloway had actually a lot of anthropology in it, in ways.
That makes grammatical sense, yeah.
I figured it, I felt it did, but we haven't dug into it. But honestly, the other ones, both lexically and grammatically, To the Lighthouse looks like a novel.
Fascinating.
It's not what I was expecting. I was in the camp that this is going to be the really interesting one. It turns out that no, it's not. In fact, James Joyce is the same way, except for the sermon in the middle of Portrait of an Artist. It's also very novel-y in a way that we weren't.
But that grammatically, that makes sense to me.
Yeah. That's part of the project, right? That we think this is going to be interesting, and then we look at the results and we read them and are like, oh, yeah, I guess when we read it, it does kind of make sense.
Well, one of the things that comes up repeatedly for me is that this is very much about clauses more than it is about individual lexemes.
Part of it is. So if you think of it hierarchically, it's like there are ways of writing that use a lot of clauses and ways of writing that don't use a lot of clauses. And once you've made that first division, then in the midst of the ways of writing that use a lot of clauses, the individual lexemes do a lot of work differentiating those, and then, no, but you're absolutely right in the hierarchy.
We'll talk more about it too.
I'm looking forward to it.
Great.
I'm interested in your rhetoric or style and your use of the word genre was interesting to me because you kept translating it for us as when we're talking about the grammar in terms of style.
Yep.
And as I'm imagining it, it's something maybe closer to what we're used to talking about as rhetorical register or something like that. And yet, this last series of slides kind of gets at what genre theory sort of, at its best, is toggling between. That is the difference between descriptive and prescriptive modes of being. And so I kind of wanted first for you to talk about you or your group's use of the word genre as microgenre, and whether or not you're really committed to that, or whether it's just a rhetorical move to sort of get literature people interested in DH stuff, or whether it's, and then finally, I guess this last bit about the prescriptive, whether or not you think, at some point you'd be able to come up with something like a DNA of a Conan Doyle story, so we know that, like, okay, we're at this point of the novel, we need to insert a natural science segment because this is, during the descriptive portion where everything's explained, and whether or not it could be this kind of DNA sort of structure of.
Really good questions, both. The first one I wish I had a better answer for you, in that I've always been in favor of microgenres from a rhetorical standpoint, but that was a very controversial move. A number of our first meetings ended with, what are we actually going to call this project when we stop calling it microgenres? And so far, none of us have been able, micro-rhetoric actually was on the table for a bit, but what we're talking about is not really rhetoric in the same way, and I'm speaking, I'm an 18th centuryist, so I'm speaking from a very 18th century-esque perspective, but the kind of things that we're seeing in the novels are not really rhetorical, because one of the things that I'm arguing is that and that's why I start with Caleb Williams, right? Because what Godwin is doing, he's doing very much on the surface. He says, I'm importing political justice into this novel in order that the combination may help convince you of my arguments. And so it's not really, it's a rhetorical move, but the actual content of the thing, I don't think, or I would push back against that being just rhetoric, because it's about the way the information is organized and delivered to the reader, as opposed to the various things that go into like an understanding of what a rhetorical phrase might be. So I understand why it's not quite genre. It's maybe microdisciplinary style, but we're trying to think expansively about what genre means. And part of eventually when this gets written up in the next, hopefully a few months, and we start thinking about pamphlets, one of the arguments that I want to make is that thinking about these as generic shifts and thinking about the ways in which those generic shifts inform the DNA of genres is interesting. In terms of the second part, like I said, we've been experimenting a lot with science fiction because it seems to be doing a number of interesting things. So, for example, we have a corpus of science fiction novels that are not related here. And in a slightly separate project, when we're looking at how science fiction didactically teaches the readers how to interpret its worlds, we looked at improbable phrases. So what phrases, what bigrams in this case, what two-word combinations are common in science fiction, made up of words that are common in all sorts of other novels, but never appear together. So you can imagine like laser phone, for example. Like laser phones might show up in a science fiction novel, which does a certain amount of work in terms of showing how people communicate. And you recognize the word laser and you recognize the word phone, but by putting them together in an improbable combination, you recognize that you're not in the world that you know. But what we found was the most distinctive, not quite the most frequent, the most distinctive improbable bigram in science fiction, circulatory system. And the second, right? And the second most frequent was carotid artery, which we're still digging into, and that's why that became a kind of microgeneric project, because of the ways in which science fiction is importing the lexemes, but interestingly also the style of things that we don't necessarily think that it should be importing. So we imagined that it would be some combination of like literature and hard science. But in fact, it's much more likely to be a combination of literature and some kind of medical writing. And we have theories about the ways in which those terms might be more familiar to a mid-20th century audience than, say, for example, physics terms that have to do with relativity and quantum mechanics, especially to audiences of that period. But that's exactly the kind of thing that we're trying to get at in the project. Can we think about science fiction as a kind of DNA structure? Like, at this point, we need to import certain kinds of combinations of words that are familiar in very different contexts that the reader finds familiar but jarring within thinking about the circulatory system of an alien, for example, or the way the galaxy's hub works like a circulatory system of traffic, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the goal. We're not there yet, but very much that's the kind of genre argument.
Have you speculated at all what might change if you went beyond the Anglophone? That's part of the question. Because it seems to be an assumption here that people, for example, doing anthropology might be writing in the same style regardless of language and so forth. And I don't know whether that's true. And also, have you speculated what might happen if you took the category natural sciences? If you think about the splitters and the lumpers in terms of taxonomies of discipline, you have split out more in the humanities and social sciences. You lump all the natural sciences together, but it's possible that the style of people writing in physics, even in English, even in one time span, may not be the same as the style of people writing on biology, even in the same language and the same time span.
I agree completely with both of those. So the Anglophone thing we speculated a bit about, with the exception of capital, which was a very, very controversial inclusion for two reasons. One, because it's a translated work, and two, because we had a large argument about whether it should be politics or economy or philosophy, or neither. With the exception of that one, and it turns out that that really didn't matter because that's not what the model was saying, we tried to use only English language text, which is a false representation of what people or writers of the period were reading, absolutely. But given the features that we were using, we didn't want to use translations because it was hard to sort of ascertain exactly what the best translations to use would be. And many of the writers that we're talking about, like Conrad, for example, was reading not in English translations, but frequently in the originals. So we deliberately made that exclusion, but I don't feel good about it. In the same way that most of the projects we do tend to focus on monolingual projects, whether English or German or French or something else. But cross-linguistic comparisons using computational methods is difficult in a number of ways. But I take the point that there's something really interesting happening there that we're absolutely not capturing. The second one, which, remind me what the second one was?
Why did you lump all the natural
Right.
sciences together?
Yes.
The way you split out the non-natural sciences?
That was also a point of contention. Part of it had to do with the ways in which certain kinds of popular disciplinary writing was construed at the time. Abigail, who works on the history of scientific disciplines, made a persuasive argument that, for example, so a large part of our reference corpus that we train the model off of aren't technical books, but are books that are more, I don't want to say popular, but are science books made for a more general audience. Think The Origin of the Species, for example, is in our corpus. And part of the argument that she made, which I was persuaded by, is that novelists who are thinking in terms of language and in terms of literature are not necessarily thinking in terms of the more technical aspects, but instead are reading sort of within a disciplinary constellation that would be more familiar to them. So they might pick up and read Fraser's The Golden Bough, for example, or they might pick up and read The Aesthetics of Ideas in late 20th century Britain. But they'd be more likely to pick up and read something like The Origin of the Species than they would to pick up like an actual biology paper or the Transactions of the Royal Academy and read that. I'm not convinced that that was the right call, and in fact I see very much a really good argument for splitting up that differentiation and finding like 10 biology, 10 physics, 10 chemistry, 10 mechanics, 10 engineering texts, and seeing what changes. I mean, it was a call we made, but I can see entirely the wisdom of trying it and seeing what changes.
So while we were talking and explaining your methodology, I kept thinking, like, this sounds so arbitrary, like how to do a conflict. But so instead of, I mean, I guess I'll ask, you know, how you chose texts, how you chose disciplines, how you, whatever. But instead I'll ask about, like, history. Have you tried writing, like, a contemporary novel through this? Like, Beloved, or, I don't know, I mean, like, how does that?
So that's actually the big, so one of the angles we're looking at is that kind of generic level. The other one that at this moment is currently running, but it's just a really big task. We have we have exactly 28,209 American literature texts from 1789 to 2013. And one of the things we're doing is running each one of those, or texts, I mean by novels. We have that many novels. And we're running all of those through this classification.
Which was set up for a time.
Which was set up exactly for a time specific. And the goal there is twofold. One, eventually we're just going to extract the results that fall into our time span, and that gives us a much larger way to look at things. Xander, one of the students, keeps calling this the Connect 4 problem. He wants to layer graphs on top of each other and see if there's a place within certain kinds of novels where a shift always, like, is the first part more likely to be history than anything else? Is the last part more likely to be psychology than anything else? And once we have enough exemplars, we can start thinking about doing, I'm not convinced it's going to work, but it's worth a try. The other part is looking very expansively, because Michaela, who's also working with Michaela Bronstein on the project, has a theory that, in fact, we shouldn't be using contemporaneous disciplinarity and contemporaneous novels, because in fact, novel writers of the later 20th century, when they're looking at anthropology, they're still reading Fraser's Golden Bough. They're not reading like contemporary mid-century anthropologists, right? They're not reading contemporary forensic anthropology. They're still reading Boaz, for example. So one of the arguments that we're trying to make, and it depends if it works, I don't know, it's still running, is that when we compare novels after our time span versus novels before, we should get a bunch of interesting effects that look somewhat more like we've already seen versus what's happening earlier. But that's complicated by questions of history and the role of the novel and the ways in which the novel writing changes. But it's something we're trying.
I am afraid that we are almost out of time. I want to say one thing, which is that one of the things that characterizes the work that Mark and his colleagues do, and that you've seen it here, really important, is that they are really assiduously honest about things they tried that didn't work, and also things they thought of that they didn't try. So, because that's a lot of the questions that have come up here. There's only so much work people can do, and I think that it's a really interesting epistemological model for humanistic labor to actually think about what it would look like to talk about all the things you thought about that turned out not to be anything, that of course are part of the work we do, but which tend to disappear in a discipline where we tend to reproduce only our positive results. That is what we find. Anyway, please join me in thanking Mark so much.